ucciso per amore, mi mettevo nel treno da sola, andavo a Napoli a vedere se lo incontravo. Volevo o farmi ammazzare o ammazzare.
She was 6 months pregnant, yet walked into a crowded bar in Naples and emptied her revolver, sending 29 bullets into the man she blamed for her husband's murder. Who was Pupetta Maresca? From that explosive act of revenge, the story of Ascinta Pupetta Maresca would unfold as something far more than a crime of passion. It became the legend of Italy's first female boss of the Camorra, a tale of beauty, blood, and unflinching defiance.
Poi quella volta che mi ci sono incontrata, lui è venuto verso di me con una pistola non indifferente, grande, e pure io portavo, quando lui mi mandava a minacciare, poi mi sono decisa e portavo anche la pistola nella borsa. Quindi lui mi si è avvicinato vicino allo sportello della macchina, voleva aprire lo sportello perché mi uccidessero i suoi killer che aveva con lui. A questo secondo voi io cosa avrei dovuto fare?
Si era difesa?
Non mi ci difese né più né meno. Mi è venuto Dio ha voluto che morisse lui. Però potevo morire tranquillamente anch'io perché lui mi ha sparato bello 12 colpi di pistola, non è che me ne ha sparato uno, mentre a me erano solo 6 perché la mia era una pistola così, una 7,65 piccola, si portava in una borsetta piccola praticamente.
The wedding dress was still white when the bullets ripped through him. Naples, 1955. The sun was blazing over the cobblestone streets of a city that pulsed with life and death. The scent of espresso and gunpowder often mingled in the air. And in one of its oldest neighborhoods, a beautiful young bride was about to make headlines not for her wedding, but for her vengeance. They killed my husband, and so I killed the man who ordered it. I did what the law would never have the courage to do. These words weren't whispered in confession or uttered in shame. They were declared in open court by a woman in her early 20s, dressed not in black, but in bold defiance. Her name was Ascinta Pupetta Maresca. To the people of Naples, she would become a symbol of honor and fury. To the Italian authorities, she was a dangerous reminder that the Camorra didn't just belong to men. But before she was the face of vengeance, she was just a girl born into a family where silence was a virtue, loyalty was sacred, and death often came with a kiss. Pupetta was born in 1935 in Castellammare di Stabia, a coastal town not far from Naples, where the sea was calm, but the streets were not. Her family was deeply entrenched in the Camorra, the Neapolitan version of the Mafia. She was one of 10 siblings in a household where power wasn't whispered about, it was wielded. From a young age, Pupetta had something others noticed: beauty. Yes, she won the Miss Rio Insonita pageant as a teenager, but also fire, a stubborn, explosive defiance. She didn't just walk into rooms, she commanded them. Neighbors would later remember her as proud, quick-tempered, and fiercely independent. Even as a teenager, Pupetta wasn't afraid to talk back to men who tried to control her. In the post-war chaos of southern Italy, that kind of spirit was rare and dangerous. But what truly changed her life came in the form of love, or perhaps destiny disguised as love. In 1955, Pupetta fell for Pasquale Simonetti, known in the underworld as Pasqualone Enola. He was 33, older than her by over a decade, but he had power, charm, and a reputation that turned heads and opened doors. He was a fruit and vegetable wholesaler by trade, but in Naples, that meant much more. He controlled territory, collected debts, and ran with the Camorra. The marriage was rushed. Some said it was for love. Others said it was a business alliance, to criminal families merging through union. Either way, Pupetta became the wife of a kingpin, and she relished it. A honeymoon in blood. Just 3 months after the wedding, Pasquale was dead. It happened on a summer day, July 16th, 1955. He was walking through the crowded mercato of Naples, surrounded by the colors and chaos of street vendors. Suddenly, gunshots cracked the air. Pasquale collapsed, bleeding into the street. The killer didn't flee far. Witnesses saw the shooter, and the man behind the hit was no mystery to Pupetta. His name was Antonio Esposito, a rival in the fruit distribution racket. A man who, according to many, was jealous of Pasquale's success and wanted his share of the market. For days, Pupetta said nothing. She didn't cry publicly. She didn't plead for police help. She simply disappeared. Then, a week later, she walked into Esposito's office. Calm, composed, pregnant. She pulled a revolver from her purse and shot him. Right there, in broad daylight, 13 times. Naples gasped. Italy froze. This wasn't just another mafia hit. This was a woman. Young, beautiful, educated, executing a man in cold blood. In the name of honor. Newspapers ran her photo above the fold. They called her the Camorra bride. La Pupa Vindicativa. La Justiciera Ingana. The Avenger in a skirt. When she was arrested, Pupetta didn't deny it. She admitted it. Boldly. I killed for love. For justice. He murdered my husband. Would you not have done the same? The courtroom overflowed. She sat like a queen in exile. Defiant, radiant, unrepentant. And when she was sentenced to 18 years in prison, she didn't flinch. To the public, she became a folk hero. Songs were written about her. Postcards with her face sold in markets. She was the woman who dared to do what many men only whispered about. But behind the glamour and applause, there was rot. Because prison would not break her, but it would change her. The baby, the bars, and the betrayals. They took away my freedom, but not my pride. They locked me in a cell, but I still had him, my son. Behind the stone walls of the Pasquale women's prison, Pupetta Maresca paced the cold floors with the weight of 2 lives inside her. Her own, and the unborn child of her murdered husband. It was 1955. She had just been sentenced to 18 years for the assassination of Antonio Esposito, the man who had ordered her husband's death. Pupetta never denied it. In fact, she wore her crime like armor. But now, far from the flashes of the courtroom and the ballads sung in her name, she faced a silence more terrifying than bullets. The Pasquale prison wasn't just stone and steel. It was filled with whispers. Women who had stabbed their husbands. Others locked up for petty theft. But none of them carried the same infamy. Pupetta was a celebrity inmate. Young, beautiful, unrepentant, and pregnant with the bloodline of a murdered Camorra boss. Inside, she remained composed. But prison life tested her in ways bullets never could. Guards alternated between treating her with morbid fascination and disdain. Some whispered her name like a legend. Others called her a murderer with lipstick. But Pupetta endured. In December of that same year, with iron bars framing her window, she gave birth to her son. She named him Pasquale, after the father he would never meet. It should have been a moment of joy. Instead, it marked the beginning of a slow unraveling. Outside the prison walls, Naples had not stood still. While Pupetta bore her sentence, others had moved in to claim the vacant throne her husband left behind. Power was a vacuum, and in the underworld, it filled fast. Pasquale's former allies no longer whispered Pupetta's name with reverence. They saw her son as a threat, a future claimant to a kingdom they now controlled, a child born of vengeance and legacy. And then came the betrayal. Rumors filtered through the prison. Attempts had been made to warn the family. A stray bullet had been fired near the Maresca compound. A cousin had been questioned. Roughed up, there were whispers that some of Pasquale's old enemies were watching Pupetta's son too closely. And then, in 1960, Pupetta's sentence was reduced. A mixture of public sympathy and good behavior bought her early release, after serving only 5 years. But what she found when she stepped out of prison wasn't the world she had known. Naples had changed, and so had she. She no longer dressed like a queen. Her gaze was harder now, her steps quieter. There was no parade waiting outside the prison gates, just silence and unfinished business. She returned home to raise her son, but life outside had its own rules, and Pupetta quickly realized that honor meant nothing if the family was no longer feared. The old alliances had crumbled. New names now controlled the ports, the markets, the streets. She was a woman, a widow, a single mother, in a world where power had a male face and a gun behind every promise. But Pupetta had never been one to beg, and so, slowly, quietly, she began to build again. It was during this time, in the early 1960s, that Pupetta was introduced to a man named Umberto Amaturo, a name that would define the next chapter of her life. He was charming, intelligent, handsome, a smuggler with ties to South America and a growing influence in Naples' cocaine trade. To some, he was refined, educated even. To others, he was a cold-blooded opportunist. Pupetta, perhaps craving connection, or perhaps craving power, fell for him. Their relationship was passionate, but turbulent. They fought like fire and gunpowder. Amaturo wanted respect. Pupetta already had it, and that made her dangerous. They would have twins together, and for a while, she tried to live outside the headlines. But the old ghosts never died. They just waited. And in the shadows of Naples, someone else was watching, waiting, planning. The son, the gunman, and the crack in the legend. I've already buried one man I loved. I won't bury my son. That's what Pupetta was heard saying in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Her voice was sharp, unmistakably protective, almost prophetic. By the mid-1970s, Ashinda Pupetta Maresca had lived lives already, once as the grieving bride who took justice into her own hands, then as the mother and partner to a rising underworld player. But her past was not past. It was a shadow, long, silent, and creeping ever closer. Her son, Pasquale, named after his murdered father, was now a teenager, bold, confident, and craving his own place in the world. And in Naples, finding your place could mean one of two things. You lived fast and died young, or you bowed your head and survived. Pasquale refused to bow. Growing up with Pupetta as your mother meant understanding violence before understanding peace. He had seen the photographs, heard the ballads, understood that his very existence was tied to blood. But there was a hunger in him, a hunger not just for respect, but for legacy. Some say he admired his father, a man he never met. Others say he idolized his mother, the woman who had once faced the court with no regret. But Pupetta had changed. Time had tempered her rage. Her love for her children was all-consuming, and she began to fear the same roads they now seemed destined to walk down. She tried to control him. She tried to steer him away. But Naples didn't let go that easily. Pasquale was already making his own connections, rubbing shoulders with smugglers, extortionists, and rising gang lords. He wanted a seat at the table, and he was willing to fight for it. And then, someone offered him a gun. It was May 1974. Pupetta had noticed her son acting strange, quieter than usual, restless. She didn't need to ask questions. She felt something was wrong. That evening, Pasquale left the family home, said he was meeting a friend, said he wouldn't be long, but he never returned. 2 hours later, police were called to the outskirts of Naples. A small, battered car was found abandoned along the Via della Solfatara. Inside the driver's seat, slumped forward and soaked in blood, was a young man with a bullet through his neck. A clean shot, execution style. It was Pasquale, just 18 years old. When Pupetta arrived at the morgue, she didn't scream. She didn't faint. Witnesses said she stood over her son's body for almost an hour, refusing to move. Then she whispered something no one could hear and walked out. Later, she would be heard saying, "They didn't just kill my son. They tried to kill me again." But this time, the target wasn't as clear. Pasquale had no public enemies, no known rivalries. So who ordered the hit? Pupetta had a theory, and it pointed directly to the man lying next to her every night. Umberto Amaturo had grown distant in the months before Pasquale's murder. Business in Peru, phone calls at odd hours, hidden accounts, and a visible discomfort whenever Pupetta mentioned her son's desire to get involved. What followed was a brutal unraveling of trust. Friends of the family reported fierce arguments. One neighbor claimed Pupetta threw a glass ashtray at Amaturo's head. Another said she began sleeping with a pistol under her pillow. It didn't take long before whispers started to spread. Amaturo had arranged the hit. Why? No one knew for sure. Jealousy, power, a calculated move to remove a threat to his own growing empire. Or did he fear Pasquale would eventually turn on him? Whatever the motive, Pupetta believed one thing: the man she once called lover was now her enemy. In public, Pupetta wore black again, but this time, it wasn't for mourning, it was war paint. She began reaching out to old contacts, making quiet calls, visiting old faces who still remembered the woman who'd once brought down a man in broad daylight and walked into prison with her head high. But things had changed. The Camorra of the 1970s wasn't the Camorra she'd known. It had become more brutal, more international, less romanticized. And Pupetta was older now, not the defiant young beauty she once was. The city whispered behind her back, "She's lost her touch. Her time has passed. The world belongs to younger men now." But they were wrong, because Pupetta wasn't planning a return. She was planning a reckoning. The woman, the war, and the warrant. "He took my son from me, and I will not rest until he pays, in blood or in prison." By the late 1970s, Pupetta Maresca was no longer just the widow who avenged her husband. She was the mother of a murdered son, and a woman on a mission. But unlike before, this wasn't a mission of honor. It was obsession, grief soaked in gasoline. Naples had changed, and so had she. Once admired for her boldness, now she was feared for her unpredictability. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her lethal. Umberto Amaturo. To the outside world, he was a businessman, one of those sharply dressed men who knew how to shake hands in silence. He had built connections in South America, smuggled cocaine through the ports of Naples, and moved money faster than most governments could track. But to Pupetta, he was a liar, a traitor, a snake who had slithered into her life and stolen her son from under her nose. And so she began building a case, not in court, but in the only courtroom that mattered in her world, the street. She whispered to former allies, traded favors, dug into Amaturo's business dealings. At night, she sat by her son's old belongings and wrote down every name, every address, every possibility. Some say she even considered another assassination. But the Pupetta of the 50s was not the Pupetta of the 70s. Eyes were everywhere now, and her every move was watched, including by the police. For decades, Pupetta had been a symbol of the blurred lines between love, loyalty, and lawlessness. But now, the state was ready to bring her legend to a close. An anti-mafia crackdown swept southern Italy in 1978. Dozens of names were drawn up. Wiretaps hummed with secrets. And one name came up again and again, Pupetta Maresca. The authorities weren't sure what they had, but they knew something was brewing. A woman like Pupetta didn't bury her only son and walk away quietly. And then it happened, the moment investigators had waited for. a former associate of Amaturo, arrested in a smuggling sting, began to talk, and what he said sent a chill through the prosecutor's office. There was a plan. Not just drugs, not just money. There was a plan to get rid of the kid, Pupetta's boy, and she knew it. With that, the door swung open. In 1982, Pupetta was arrested. The charge, complicity in organized crime. Authorities claimed she had aided the criminal enterprise led by Umberto Amaturo, that she had knowledge of drug trafficking, that she had helped cover financial dealings, that she had blood on her hands, or had at least dipped them in it. But in truth, the case was as much about symbolism as evidence. They didn't just want to arrest Pupetta. They wanted to dismantle her. She was interrogated for days. She denied everything. She spoke calmly, with poise, the same way she had decades earlier, when she admitted to killing her husband's murderer. But this time, she didn't confess. This time, she waited for the law to bend or break. The trial dragged on for years. The prosecutors painted her as a relic of the old Camorra, a woman whose beauty once masked brutality. They said she wasn't just a grieving mother, but a strategist, a partner in crime, a woman who knew where the bodies were buried, maybe even helped dig the graves. Pupetta's defense was simple. I am a mother. I lost my son. I did not kill for profit. I did not run a cartel. But the courtroom wasn't about truth. It was about power. And both sides had something to prove. Ultimately, the case faltered. Evidence thinned. Witnesses recanted. Amaturo himself fled to South America. Out of reach, Pupetta was released. But freedom no longer tasted sweet. She had outlived two men, one murdered in the street, the other vanished into exile. She had buried her son, lost her status, her power, her purpose. And though she walked free, she was no longer feared, only remembered. Those who knew her in her youth would later say she began to disappear long before her death. Not physically, but spiritually. Her defiance dimmed, her voice softened. She rarely left her home. And yet, every year, on the anniversary of her son's death, she would dress in black, stand by the window, and stare out toward the street, waiting, watching, perhaps for justice, perhaps for ghosts, a letter, a ghost, and the final curtain. If you're reading this, then I'm already dead. But she needs to know, it wasn't just business. It was me. The letter arrived anonymously, tucked inside an unmarked envelope, hand-delivered to a local paper in Naples in the spring of 1997. It wasn't long, barely 2 pages, typed, but with one line handwritten at the bottom. She deserves to know. The journalist who opened it almost threw it away, until he read the name scrawled near the top, Pasquale Simonetti Jr., Pupetta's son. Dead since 1974. Shot through the neck. A murder that had remained officially unsolved for over 2 decades. Everyone had suspicions, but no one had confessed. Until now. The letter claimed to be written by a man dying of cancer, once involved in the operations of Umberto Amaturo, Pupetta's former partner. The author never revealed his name, but his details were disturbingly specific: locations, dates, phone numbers, bribes, payouts. And then came the sentence that changed everything. Pasquale was becoming a problem. Not for us, but for Umberto. He saw the boy as reckless, as a symbol she cared for more than him. So he gave the word. I was in the car that night. The words were simple, cold, final, and the implications were devastating. Pupetta had been right all along. The man she had trusted after her husband's death. The father of her twins. The man who had once shared her bed and helped raise her children. Had ordered the execution of her son. The letter made front-page news in Naples. For a city so steeped in omerta, the code of silence. This was a rare crack in the wall. Reporters flocked to Pupetta's quiet apartment in Castellammare di Stabia. She refused them all. For weeks, she said nothing. Then one evening, she opened her window and spoke to a single journalist waiting on the street below. Her voice was clear but heavy, like marble cracked by time. "I knew, but knowing doesn't bring him back. Justice delayed is justice denied." That was all she said. And then she closed the window. At the time the letter surfaced, Amaturo was living in South America, rumored to be moving between Peru and Brazil. He had evaded Italian justice for decades, helped by fake passports, corrupt officials, and silence. But the world was changing. Interpol had grown more aggressive. South American governments, under pressure, began tightening their borders. And suddenly, Amaturo wasn't so invisible. In 2002, he was arrested in Sao Paulo, extradited to Italy. His drug charges reopened, his criminal empire exposed. And once again, Pupetta's name surfaced. Investigators tried to tie him to Pasquale's murder, but Amaturo denied everything. When asked directly by a journalist, "Did you order the death of Pupetta's son?" he replied with a smile, "If I had, would I still be breathing?" It was a threat, or maybe a confession in disguise. After the letter and Amaturo's arrest, Pupetta's life fell into quiet obscurity. She no longer walked the streets like a legend. She spent most of her days behind drawn curtains, surrounded by fading photographs and flickering memories. One neighbor recalled seeing her at the cemetery once a week, always in black, always alone. She had buried 3 men she loved, her husband, her son, and the idea of justice. By now, Pupetta had become a myth, a ghost story told in Neapolitan cafes, a name that made old men nod in respect and young men ask questions. But the truth, it was written on her face. Not regret, not pride, just the weight of everything. On December 29th, 2015, Ashunda Pupetta Maresca died in her home. She was 80 years old. Her funeral was small, no grand procession, no brass band, just a few family members and distant friends. No Camorra guards, no gold caskets, just silence. But in Naples, silence speaks louder than applause. One journalist, the same one who had first received the letter years earlier, left a single rose on her grave. Attached was a note that read, "She didn't live by the law, but she lived by her own. Legacy and blood, the woman who dared to stand alone. They feared her not because she killed, but because she did it without permission." In the dark mythology of Naples, where crime families are built on whispered oaths and blood-soaked tradition, few names echo louder than Pupetta Maresca. But it's not just her beauty, nor her crimes, that make her unforgettable. It's what she represented, a woman who didn't just belong to the underworld. She defied it, and for that, she earned a different kind of legacy, one born not of power, but of defiance. For decades, the Camorra thrived on male domination. Women were expected to stand beside their husbands, grieve in silence, raise children to inherit the rules, but never break them. Pupetta shattered the mold. She didn't just kill for her husband, she announced it to the world. She didn't just stand by her man, she avenged him. In doing so, she exposed a fundamental truth that terrified Naples' criminal elite. Honor can be female, and vengeance can wear lipstick. Her act, gunning down Antonio Esposito in cold blood, wasn't just murder. It was rebellion, not against the law, but against the unspoken hierarchy of the Camorra itself. A woman had acted without permission, without asking, without being told, and they never forgave her for it. Even when they praised her, even when songs were written in her name, the men of Naples watched Pupetta with quiet unease, because they knew, if one woman could rise that high, what stopped the others? In the years after her imprisonment, Pupetta's legend morphed. She became a subject of films, novels, and even romantic ballads. But every version of her story seemed to end in the same place. A beautiful girl in a black dress, gun in her purse, walking out of a courtroom with her head held high. What most of these stories left out was the cost. The nights alone, the whispered threats, the betrayal of the man she once trusted, the slow erosion of her family. The way her legend cast a shadow too heavy for even her son to live under. They called her La Justiciera Ingona, the Avenger in a skirt. But the truth, she was also a mother, a daughter, a woman who carried too much grief in this small body. And that grief never left her. By the 2000s, the new generation of Neapolitan criminals barely remembered her. They were younger, louder, more brutal, less about codes of honor and more about cash and cruelty. But in the narrow alleys of Castellammare di Stabia, some still whispered her name with reverence. Old women would tell their granddaughters she wasn't afraid of any man, and grandsons would be warned, don't think a woman can't be more dangerous than a gun. Still, as the years passed, Pupetta faded from the front pages. The woman who once dominated courtrooms and magazine covers spent her last years in stillness. Her empire gone, her family scattered, her heart scarred. And yet, she remained unbroken. Was Pupetta Maresca a hero? A criminal? A mother desperate for justice? Or was she something even more difficult to define? A woman born into a world that only gave her two options: silence or violence. And she chose the one that let her speak. What she did cannot be excused, but neither can it be ignored. She carved her name into history using bullets, blood, and a brutal kind of love. And when she finally died, the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was awe. She didn't ask for power. She took it. She didn't beg for justice. She became it. And in doing so, she didn't just change the rules. She wrote new ones. This was the story of Pupetta Maresca, the beauty queen turned killer, mother turned myth, woman turned weapon. She may be gone, but in Naples, when the streets grow quiet and the shadows grow long, you can still hear her name, spoken not in fear, but in respect.